Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for still staying with us after lunch. And this is a tough spot to be in for speakers, since I know this is the time when our afternoon slumber might kick in after food. So I hope I'll keep this entertaining for you, and I hope this will be more interactive, so that you won't be bored and I'm not just reading to you from the slides. So my name is Ying. I am an in-house counsel for a Fortune 500 company. And my specialty area is in compliance, specifically trade compliance. And I'll go into that a little bit more in detail once I go through my slides. But Hui asked me to come here and share with you my experience about compliance in general and how that's important for supply chain, and just introducing the concept of supply chain. This is a big concept these days. Everybody talk about it. And I don't know, for the business and entrepreneurs in the room, how familiar you may be, but I will go through and, hopefully we can have a conversation that's productive. So here, I want to start with a slide of these companies, and these are the 25 companies that are recognized as the top companies with the most successful supply chain management. And these companies are not foreign to you, I'm sure. In fact, many of you are frequent customers. So I confess I'm definitely an addicted shopper to, for some of these companies. So for example, whenever I type in www.a into my browser, the first the company that pops up is Amazon. It already recognizes where I want to go just with the letter A because of how frequently I shop on Amazon. So this is my go-to for all my, baby care diaper needs, my like household cleanser. I don't even have to go into a physical store to pick them up. And another store that I always frequent every day around this time after lunch, this little afternoon slumber kicks in. If I'm not already in Starbucks, I'm on my way looking for one. So it's very this store is thankfully now one on every block, so it's not very hard to find. So thankfully, I get my caffeine fix every afternoon. And I know that the younger people in the room, please don't be addicted to caffeine like me. But so now, why are these companies so successful? Other than because they produce great products, they also have to deliver those great products to us in a very efficient and effective way. And have you ever considered how do they do that? So the key to that is supply chain management. So what exactly, when you have a good supply chain management, that drives the cost of the overall cost of business operation and increases overall efficiency, and also produces better end results for your customers who are happy and want to keep on going back to shop at the place. And at the end of the day, isn't that what a successful company is about? Hence, supply chain is tremendously important to the success of the company. So we talked about supply chain. What is it really? What does it mean? So the business definition of a supply chain is the system of organizations, people, activities, information, and resources involved in moving a product or service from supplier to customer. So here you see a chain. So basically the very starting point of any product is raw materials. So the raw materials are procured by suppliers, and who in exchange sends them to the manufacturers, and the manufacturers, after they produce the product, send it to a distribution center. It could be a variety of different types of distributor. Nowadays we have the most popular is e-commerce distribution centers. You go online, you buy product. And then there is the physical store distribution centers. So retailers, wholesalers, all types of distributors. And then in the end, it comes to you, me, the consumers. So you see, all companies, no matter the size or industry, is a part of supply chain. And therefore, we all need to understand if you're going to be thinking about business, what role you'll be playing in the chain of supply. So here I want to open the floor up to the audience and ask, can somebody share with me your idea about business, or if you already have a business, and tell me a little bit about where you think you fit along the supply chain? Volunteer? Yes, please.
Yeah, I have been doing Amazon FBA a little bit. For Amazon, basically you buy products from Alibaba or some places in China, and then they ship it over to a distribution center here in the US, and you can distribute that all the products through Amazon.
Okay, wonderful. And so you started up the store on Amazon. You're an Amazon seller.
Yes.
Okay, great. What do you sell?
I'm selling various wedding products.
Okay, wonderful. That's good for you. And so, can you tell me, so when you are selling these products, how do you keep your inventory? How do you know, what are the products that would be, I don't know, in demand, or is it just purely through the placing of order directly from?
I think it basically you order a certain quantity of products from your supplier, say in China somewhere, and they will ship it to the distribution center here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And Amazon has their own database, and they keep track of how. So when a buyer buys a product from the distribution center, they will ship it out directly from their warehouse, and you can see the item gets deducted from their database automatically.
Okay, and then how do you determine how much you, order in the beginning? Is it just based on experience?
Yeah, this is a little bit trial and error, I would say.
Okay.
It really depends on how. There are various softwares that you can use to track the sales data from similar vendors.
Okay.
They have their own algorithm that they run, and then you can see how popular the item is and how fast it gets shipped out of other people's inventory. And by that, you can sort of estimate how many items you can sell in a month.
Okay.
And based on that, you can sort of determine how much you need to order from the supplier.
I see. Well, that's very useful. Thank you for sharing that. That's very good to know. So you see, I guess you're sort of on the distribution side, and Amazon has an amazing, very complex supply chain system, and my company actually also helps Amazon to do part of their distribution centers. Okay. If not, I will go on to another real-life example. So thank you for sharing about Amazon. I'll talk about Walmart. So Walmart, we all know to be the biggest retail company in the world. It's been that way for many years now. So it started off as one single company in 1962 in a city in Arkansas. So the founder, Sam Walton, used to work for JCPenney's, and he decided he wanted to venture out and start his own business. So he started just by selling goods, and he bought bulk quantities at discount prices and tried to sell them to consumers. And it was a very simple model to begin with. The idea was to provide consumers with goods whenever and whatever they want. So now Walmart operates in around 27 countries, and there are 11,000 stores worldwide. It's grown very significantly, and so one of the secret to its success is the supply chain. So Walmart's supply chain innovation began with the company removing a couple links in the supply chain, so making it an easier supply chain to work with. So initially, like I said, it purchased bulk merchandise that were transported directly into the store. Then in the 1980s, it began to work directly with manufacturers to cut costs and more efficiently manage its supply chain. So what they used was an initiative called Vendor Managed Inventory, where the manufacturers become responsible for managing their own products in the warehouses. So what that means is the Walmart was able to expect close to 100% order fulfillment on merchandise because the manufacturers were making the products as they were getting ordered, and so there was no overstock of inventory, there was no understock, so it was much more efficient model to work with. And it continued to improve its supply chain by strategically partnering with its vendors and offering them potential for long-term and high-volume purchases in exchange for large possible discounts, lowest possible prices. And so strategically, partnershiping with vendors is very important because that maintains the relationship, and over time, an established relationship, an established model will cut cost and increase efficiency. Another thing that they did was cross-docking. So cross-docking is a supply chain methodology where it cuts the middle layers out of the transit of goods. So basically, what that is there's a direct transfer from an inbound or exbound truck trailer without any storage. And so you would have trucks that will unload items directly into outbound trucks to deliver to the next point of location. And that keeps the inventory and warehousing costs down, reduce transportation time, and in the end, reduces inefficiencies. So lastly, the important thing about supply chain is the technology. There are many technologies out there that's dedicated to supply chain management. As the previous person had shared, there's different softwares out there, keeping track of the inventories, knowing, projecting the amount that would be that makes sense to stock. And so Walmart has the largest information technology infrastructure of any private company in the world. And because of its investment, it is able to accurately forecast demand and track and predict inventory levels and create highly efficient transportation routes and manage customer relationships and service response logistics. So at this point, I think I've already gone through about the importance of supply chain and how it is crucial to the success of a company. Now, one of the things about supply chain management that people don't think much about is the regulatory environment surrounding supply chain. And supply chain is complex as it is, and the regulatory environment makes it even more complex. And there are increasing numbers of statutes and international standards that are putting the spotlight on responsible supply chain practices. So for example, regulations such as UK Modern Slavery Act and California Transparency in Supply Chain Act are laws that are passed to combat human trafficking and slave labor in supply chain. And people don't think about that. We think, well, we are in 2018, where is the forced labor? Where are the slavery? We don't think about that, but these things happen because of the complexity of the global supply chain. It's not just the human resources that we are employing in the developed countries like US, but also there are many human resources that global companies employ from developing countries, poor regions, and as part of the global economy, developed countries like US have placed these type of regulations into to force companies to be more responsible about where they're sourcing their laborers from. And so there is an affirmative obligation on companies to perform due diligence to ensure that their suppliers and third parties are not utilizing forced labor in any line of the supply chain, all the way down to the raw materials. And I will go into that a little bit more. I will put all of these into real life context so that you can understand what I'm talking about. And the next set of laws, things like Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So this is a regulation that prohibits U.S. companies from basically engaging in bribery and making bribes to government officials to in exchange for some sort of benefit for business. And I'll talk about that too later. And then another example is the U.S. Economics and Sanctions and Export Controls Regulations. These are a whole set of different rules and regulations governed by different U.S. agencies that are very extensive and broad-reaching in its jurisdictional reaches, and touches not just the U.S. companies, but foreign companies as well, and sanctions them for any acts that are contrary to U.S. national security. And this is the area that I'm actually an expert in, but as a compliance counsel, I need to know all three of these areas for compliance in a big company these days. So now I am going to talk about the three major compliance areas in supply chain that are in the legal realm that I know about, or that I need to make sure that my company do not breach, and that they set up a program to be able to ensure compliance with these areas. So one is the supplier integrity and social responsibility. That's the one where I talked about slave labor. And then the second is anti-corruption and anti-bribery. And the third is trade compliance. So for each one of these, I'm going to illustrate with an example of a company so that it's closer to home for you. And please pause please raise your hand if you have any questions for me. So now the first company I'm going to talk about is Unilever. So Unilever is a company that maybe a lot of you might know. They have many brands in the U.S. They own over 400 brands. They're a British-Dutch transnational consumer goods company. And so what they're well known for are Lipton tea, Magnum ice cream, and Dove, all types of Dove products, which I'm sure you all have in your bathroom at some point. So now, in the February of this year, they did something that was very, forward-leading for a company their size. So one of the main ingredients they source is palm oil. So palm oil is used in many of their products, like soap and food. And the palm oil industry, supply chain industry, is very complex. And many of the raw materials for palm oil take place in developing countries like Indonesia, where the laws are not as stringent on the type of laborers that are used. So, and then it has a lot of issues dealing with deforestation as well, because when you're trying to take palm oil from trees in those countries, they're not thinking about how it harms the natural environment. So in addition to forced labor and deforestation, these are the issues that are both relevant for human rights and environmental concerns. So as the purchaser of palm oil for their products, Unilever decided that they're going to lay bare its entire palm oil supply chain. So it includes all the suppliers and mills from which it sources the palm oil in order to boost its supply chain transparency. And that is very, very difficult to do because of how many layers in between. They're not, in most cases, when you're getting palm oil, it's not just, purchasing directly from an established company. It has transited many hands from the very raw material to agents and traders and then all these other in-between middlemen. So in order for a company to take on that task of going to the very, very bottom and tracing it all the way back to the forest it came from, that was a tremendous amount of effort and the dedication that they spent in order to tell the society and tell consumers that they care about the concerns that we are bringing out to the companies, large companies. They care about our values, about we don't want forced laborers in our products. We don't want anything to harm the environment in the products we're purchasing. So this is very, very rare thing for companies to do, even though companies have decided to, there have been other companies that, try to be transparent, but this is one of the first move that provided the entire visibility to their entire supply chain. So now another thing that they did is they also provided a supplier sourcing policy, and that basically lays out their ethical policy considerations for suppliers they want to source from, and it's a statement of their commitment to obliging by the regulatory concerns. So it's very important when you're trying to become a responsible supply chain sourcer to have that kind of policy to provide to suppliers. And that might eliminate some suppliers, like the lower cost ones, but that will ensure compliance with the laws like I talked about, the UK Modern Bribery Act and California Transparency Act. These will all help with compliance with legal obligations. And lastly, it is also common to incorporate in supplier clauses, supplier contracts, the right to audit suppliers. So not only do you tell them of what you expect, the high standards you expect them to uphold to, but you also tell them you will have the right to audit them at any time, so that they are on notice about needing to maintain a program in which you can freely audit and ensure that they are indeed keeping to their promises of not sourcing forced laborers. So these, and that's what Unilever has done, and they are now the market leader in supply chain transparency. And next, I'm going to talk about Boeing. So everybody has at one point probably taken a flight in one of the Boeing airplanes. So we all know it is one of the largest aircraft manufacturers. And even a company this size is not immune to legal, legal problems. So back in 2015, Boeing was found to have been involved in bribery. So specifically, it was one of its subsidiary companies. And so there were 7 people that the Department of Justice charged in a scheme to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribery to a procurement official. And that was in exchange for being able to win a contract. And so basically, and then that led to several the people involved in bribery, they gained a competitive advantage over others because they were able to gain confidential information that led them to win the contract, and therefore this was found to be in violation of FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and it was actually discovered through an internal investigation. So this story, even though it is about how Boeing violated the law, but it's more of a success story in the sense that it was a case where they found out the bribery first, and they worked together with the Department of Justice. Boeing leadership worked very closely and fully cooperated, And when the Department of Justice announced their findings, it made it clear that Boeing cooperated fully in the investigation and that it did more than just reactively cooperate, but also proactively self-disclose the misconduct after its compliance program disclosed the scheme. And hence, this has always been an example where legal practitioners come and share as a good example where if you have a really effective compliance program that can not only monitor but also prevent and detect, this will help a lot when you actually do make mistakes, because the government will view those as very favorable factors, and the full cooperation with government and swift corrective actions by immediately firing people involved and then implementing even more extra caution on this program to make sure further future violations of the same kind will be prevented. Those type of actions will help a lot in the story when there is an unintentional violation that's been committed. So that's a success story. And then lastly, I want to share about ZTE, Zhongxin Communications. So I think everybody in this room should have heard about Zhongxin telecommunication equipment. It's very well known for the smartphones that we see sold in China. It's and it also sells them here. And if you follow news at all, we know that ZTE has been hammered repeatedly over the past couple of years by the U.S. government for its violations of U.S. economic sanctions regulations as well as export controls. So basically what it is found to have done is ZTE, although it's a Chinese company, it has in its supply chain, it uses U.S. components in its cell phone, and that's U.S. technology that's subject to the export controls regulations. And ZTE, in violation of that, exported those smartphones with those chips to countries like Iran and Cuba, which are countries that are comprehensively embargoed by the United States. So now the jurisdictional reach, as I mentioned, is very broad with these types of regulations, because not only does it prohibit U.S. companies, but if you, no matter what company, what country you belong in, if you deal with U.S. dollars or U.S. items, you're subject to those regulations. And so it was prohibited for them to have exported the U.S. components in their cell phones to Iran and Cuba. And they did so without a license, and they did so deceptively, knowing that they shouldn't have. And that resulted in the largest fine for this type of violation in the history of export controls. So it was $1 billion US. And recently, also, after they paid the fine, again, the US government found that they did not actually discipline the upper management. They just let them continue working there. So that was another reason for placing sanctions back on ZTE again. So if you follow news, you know that back in just a couple months ago, they were placed on the restricted party list. And restricted parties basically is a list of parties where you, as a U.S. person, a U.S. company, you cannot do business with, and they're cut off from the U.S. economy. They're cut off from receiving goods from U.S. Suppliers. And they were in a very, very bad position. And only recently, I think Trump lifted the ban on them, given some of the political things that went on, and trying to make sure that it was part of the bargaining with China. In any case, after the ordeal, there's hefty penalty that they had to pay, like the $1 billion I mentioned, not to mention the reputational loss. Imagine, with your name in the headlines, how many companies in this negative way, it's very hard to find suppliers who would be willing to supply to you, because as I said, anywhere along the chain of supply chain, if you're found to be somewhat involved in some sort of regulatory wrongdoing, then you will be held liable. So the suppliers don't want to risk supplying to ZTE, and the consumers probably don't want to buy from them too. So this is just an example of when your company is not paying attention to trade compliance or compliance in general, the penalties that could be levied on you will be very, very hefty. So did you have a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
I've heard of this trade war, but since the U.S. and China's economies are so intertwined, wouldn't these tariffs actually be really detrimental on the U.S. too?
Yes, that's a good point. I think there are debates back and forth about that. It's not clear. There's no clear answer to what the effects would be. Most people tend to agree that when the trade war happens, it will be harmful for both China and U.S. And it depends on whose perspective you're looking at as well. So, the story Trump is selling is China is importing or exporting all its products to U.S. at an unfairly low price, thus gaining market share over U.S. producers. So he's saying if we impose these tariffs on Chinese goods, then it will level the playing field. That's always been their story. And so from the perspective of large domestic producers, that might be advantageous for them. So like I know for large steel companies, large aluminum U.S. companies, I mean, there are not that many left, but of the few that are left, it helps them because it will increase the price of foreign goods so that it will allow them to gain back the market share that they lost. But is it good for everybody? Is it good for consumers? Is it good for overall? I think, the answer is clear to most people that it's probably not good. And that's why it goes back and forth. It's never, I don't know what Trump will do. I can't see into his mind. I don't think anybody can. But let's just hope that it will not be aggravated beyond what's already been. So, any other questions? Okay, so basically, the conclusion of my story is, so governments, regulators, consumers, and the public expect companies to be proactive in addressing compliance issues. We, or you, or any business people cannot be the ostrich that buries its head in the sand and ignore the looming regulatory requirements around a supply chain and around companies in general. So we need to be aware of these issues. I know many of you here are very young entrepreneurs, and these are very complex issues, but these are just to give you a starting point to think about. Maybe it's a very small company you have now, none of these really matter for you, but as you're building your company, you need to place importance on compliance, because compliance is not always at the top, at the foremost thought process of an entrepreneur, but it should be. When you're building it, you need to, especially once a company grows to a certain size, it becomes the difference between a company that can successfully grow versus a company that just grows without any sort of structure. So the things you have to think about, the compliance issues, will help you be the one that successfully grow and manage your company to the better and higher stage. So that's my presentation. Thank you.